Good morning. I'm the last, so I'll try and be brief. First of all, I just want to thank the distinguished panelists for excellent presentations, and also Professor Donschbeck-Gruber and the other organizers for this fantastic colloquium. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back here at Princeton. I've been asked to comment on these issues from my perspective based on my experience in the Republic of Georgia. I lived and worked in Georgia for 2 years after I graduated from Princeton as a foreign policy and strategic communications consultant to the Georgian government. I spent 1.5 years with the President's administration and about 6 months after that with the Georgian National Security Council. So I was there in that capacity from the summer of 2006 through the summer of 2008, which meant that I left about the week before the war. Essentially, it was just fortuitous timing on my part that I did leave, but I wasn't there when it happened. I watched it unfold, unlike the rest of the world. But I was there during the months leading up to the war, which were an incredibly tense time, and I was, there up close and personal, and I saw a lot. So I think Georgia provides an interesting case for talking about issues of sovereignty and self-determination by virtue of its two separatist conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Both of these regions were autonomous in the autonomous regions of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia during the USSR. And in the early 1990s, an ethnic minority subset of the population in each of those regions invoked their right to self-determination to unilaterally secede from what was, at that point, the newly re-independent Georgian state. With self-determination, I think there's a natural tendency to ask questions like, what is a people? Do they have a right to self-determination? If so, what form should that right take? And in this discourse, the focus is on the self-determining entity itself and on the state from which it's trying to assert its autonomy. But in Georgia's case, what I find most interesting is actually something that many of the other panelists have mentioned already, which is that self-determination doesn't occur in a vacuum. And with that in mind, I'd like to raise 3 issues that relate to Georgia. The first has already been discussed by others, Professor Abulov and several of the others, in fact, and it relates to this idea of self-determination and other recognition. In practice, self-determination is an essentially hollow concept if the international community, by which I mean other pre-existing states, refuses to recognize that act of self-determination. So in Georgia's case, the separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, in fact, broke free from the central Georgian government in the early 1990s. But nobody, not even Russia, recognized them as independent states at that point. This persisted for about 15 years. It was a sort of twilight zone in which they were de facto independent, but legally still part of Georgia. The situation, of course, changed following the August 2008 war because Russia officially recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. But to date, only 3 other countries have followed Russia's lead, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and the Pacific island nation of Nauru, which has a population itself of about 11 or 12,000 people. You may be wondering, why does Nauru care about Abkhazia and South Ossetia? And the answer is actually quite simple, which is that Russia paid them $50 million. I think that's maybe one of the examples Professor Wolforth was alluding to. In addition, South Ossetia and Abkhazia have reciprocally recognized one another, for whatever that's worth, and another unrecognized republic, Transnistria in Moldova, has likewise extended recognition as well. Again, I'm not quite sure how much that counts for, but it has. So where does this leave us? Of the 192 member states of the United Nations, 188 still consider these regions to be part of Georgia. At the same time, Georgia doesn't effectively control these territories anymore. It's just a fact. And Russia, which is unquestionably the biggest and most important player in the region, considers them independent. So are they self-governing territories but not states? If that's the case, it's not because Abkhazia and South Ossetia failed on their side of the self-determination equation. It's because self-determination itself simply isn't enough. Other determination or other recognition matters at least as much. So that's the first point. And given the practical and conceptual fog surrounding the state recognition side of the self-determination coin, the second issue I want to raise is whether it makes sense to try and clarify this muddle by relying on universal principles for state recognition. This is an issue that Dr. Bardosh mentioned and others as well. Basically, there are 2 main approaches historically and legally to state recognition. The first is what I've alluded to earlier, which is this idea that recognition by others is what makes a state a state. The other competing approach is called the declaratory approach or the objective approach, which essentially asks whether certain predefined criteria have been met or satisfied by the self-determining entity, and if so, we have a state, and if not, there's no state. And this idea of objectivity or universal standards relates to Georgia mainly with regard to what's become known as the Kosovo precedent, which was this notion evoked frequently by Russia in the lead up to and following the declaration of independence by Kosovo in the early spring of 2008, that independence for Kosovo would, or perhaps should, have ramifications for other separatist conflicts around the world, most notably Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The argument was essentially, if Kosovo can do it, why can't others? And I think in some ways this seems logical and fair, but it also begs a very important question, which is that if we say two situations are similar, we have to know what similar means. Similar in what respects? If we're going to treat likes alike, how do we determine what factors are relevant to that assessment of likeness? And I think the argument with regard to Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Kosovo was something like, they were all administrative units at the sub-republic level, regions rather than constituent republics of the former Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, as the case may be. So if the region of Kosovo can become its own state all these years later, perhaps Abkhazia and South Ossetia should be able to do the same. And that goes a certain distance, I suppose, but I think at the same time, there are important differences as well. One is the international process that surrounded the declaration of independence by each of these territories. Another is the dynamics of the ethnic conflict itself. In Kosovo, the majority population in Kosovo was asserting its right to autonomy and self-determination, was forcibly repressed and expelled by the larger majority in the republic, and it was largely in response to that ethnic cleansing that was taking place against the party asserting autonomy or self-determination that it was decided ultimately that Kosovo should be granted independence from Serbia. And I think in Abkhazia, the situation was in some senses the reverse. It was in fact ethnic cleansing by the party asserting the right to self-determination that resulted ultimately in the de facto independence of Abkhazia. Before the war, for example, in the early 1990s, ethnic Abkhaz constituted about 18% of the population of Abkhazia, so less than 1/5 of the overall population. Ethnic Georgians were about 46%, and then the remaining population was a mix of Russians and Armenians, Jews, Greeks, and other ethnicities. And essentially, the ethnic Abkhaz separatists, with the help of military and paramilitary forces from Russia, managed to expel about 2/3 of the pre-war population, including basically all of the Georgian-speaking civilians. In fact, in October of 1993, the Russian Foreign Ministry itself decried the, quote, massive ethnic cleansing, unquote, that was then taking place in Abkhazia by the separatists. They, of course, have conveniently forgotten this fact now, but at the time they acknowledged it. And so in 1999, when Abkhazia held a referendum in favor of independence, it was successful, but only those remaining in Abkhazia, in other words, those people that the separatists hadn't expelled, were allowed to vote. And I think it's entirely clear that if the referendum had been put to the entire original population, it would have failed quite resolutely. So the question is then whether these differences or differences like these are meaningful. And I think that it's entirely plausible that they are. So maybe we do want to treat likes alike, but maybe Kosovo and Abkhazia, for example, aren't actually similar in relevant ways. I think it's not unreasonable that in at least some ways, Chechnya and some of the other North Caucasus republics are actually much more similar to Kosovo than Abkhazia is. South Ossetia is a different case, and I don't have time to go into the details of it there. But the question, I just sort of want to challenge this notion of precedent. I'm sympathetic in some ways to the idea of a principled approach to state recognition, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in figuring out what the content of such principles should be. And I think, as Professor Woolforth mentioned, it's also extremely unlikely for strategic reasons in Washington and Moscow and elsewhere that such principles will emerge anytime in the near future. So that's the second issue. And the third issue, finally and briefly, is just that self-determination claims are easily exploited by third parties, which raises the question of how to ensure that when other states intervene in a self-determination conflict, they're doing so from noble motives rather than insidious ones. And I raise this issue in Georgia's case because from Georgia's perspective, the situations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia have never really been about Georgians and Abkhaz or Georgians and Ossetians. For them, rightly or wrongly, it's really always been about Georgia and Russia, and about Russia's own attempts to maintain control over its former Soviet republics. What from the outside might look like a self-determination issue, an issue of self-determination of peoples, to Georgians, and I say again, rightly or wrongly, seems to them like re-annexation of their territory by their former Soviet imperial master. And in the Q&A, we'd be happy to go into details of why they feel that way. So the question then is, does the fact that Russia is an interested party make it more desirable or less desirable that they be involved in the conflict resolution process? If we think that it has to be involved for pragmatic reasons, it is the biggest player in the region, how can that involvement be structured to minimize the potential for counterproductive or fundamentally self-serving intervention? And so that's the third issue, and I'll end here. So thank you very much.